Okay, we're ready.
So hello everybody, and sorry for the delay. Technical problems as always, but now they are successfully solved. And first of all, I would thank you, the organizers of this wonderful conference, Dennis and Rose, especially for the opportunity to be here. And it was my first visit to America, and the impressions are wonderful, and I hope it will continue the whole week. And America, as we have heard, is a very rich country of silver and gold and everything, and so are a lot of countries in the world. But there are even more countries in the world which are not so rich yet, which never have had any resources of gold or silver or other precious metals. One of them is Estonia, where neither gold nor silver has never been found and will never be, obviously. How they managed to make money, literally make money, what and how? Estonia has always been dependent on foreign metal, which mostly was acquired by trade. During the 9th and 10th century, the Islamic dirhams were used by Estonians, and the 11th century witnessed the massive influx of German coined silver from Rummelsburg, as well as of Anglo-Saxon pennies from the same silver, actually. However, the Rummelsburg mines started to cease by the mid-11th century, and there are much less coin hoards in lands around the Baltic, including Estonia from the 12th century. The new important silver mines were discovered probably in 1168 in the place named Freiberg by the Margrave Otto of Meissen slightly later. The silver produced in Freiberg gave an impulse to the further development of the European and especially German economy. And fresh gas in their purses, German merchants again arrived to the pagans at the Baltic. First to leave, that was a Finno-Ugric tribe, very close relatives to Estonians, and now they are extinct, in 1180s, then to Latvians, and then in 1190s also to Estonians. They were accompanied by the missionaries and followed by the crusaders. And one can speculate that the western expansion, which subsequently led to the formation of minor feudal states in the Baltic countries during the early 14th century, would have been much less successful without silver from Freiberg. Along with the formation of medieval states and economy, the local coinage appears in what then was called Livonia, and in general today is Estonia and Latvia, starting from the first decades of the 13th century, and struck mainly in Riga, in Tallin, which was called Reval in Middle Ages, and Tartu, or Dorpat. There was abundance of silver available during the prosperous for Europe 13th and early 14th century. And no doubt it was taken to Livonia by pre-Hanseatic merchants, so-called Universitas Mercatorum, whose main basis was located on Gotland. But from the very beginning, Livonia also was a transit land for transporting silver further to the east, to Russia, that had no own silver resources then. There were special scales and weights for weighing silver in Novgorod since 1269 at latest. The three main trade partners for the three main cities of Livonia were Novgorod for Tallin, Pskov for Tartu, and Polotsk, which was part of Lithuania at that time, for Riga. There were no coins in circulation until the late 14th century in Russia. Instead, they cast silver into ingots that were called grivnas and later rubles. By the way, in this very year they celebrated the 700 years anniversary of Russian ruble. It was a special conference dedicated to that jubilee. Took place in Novgorod, so I was there and gave a lecture there, and it was quite an interesting conference. So, in good times, there obviously were no problems between Livonia and Russia what considers the trade with silver. However, in bad times, Russians could be hazardous competitors in terms of purchasing silver. Livonian written sources of the 13th century contain no data on the silver trade. However, its scope should have been quite remarkable. A bit later, in the mid-14th century, during the years 1353-58, the town councillor of Lübeck, Johann Wittenborg, alone exported to Livonia almost 2 kilograms of silver. As there was no meeting in Livonia these years, it most probably was re-exported further east to Russia. However, since 1363, the coinage restarted in Livonia, and the needs of silver in the country respectively increased. In 1385, Livonians announced a trade boycott against Russia. In 1388, a diet of the Hanseatic cities took place in Lübeck, and the deputies from Visby and Lübeck were sent to the landlords of Livonia in order to ask them to stop the export of gold and silver to the Russians. The deputy of Lübeck, Johannes Niebuhr, demanded the same even from the Teutonic Order in Prussia during the negotiations. Finally, the peace treaty between the Hanseatic League and Novgorod was signed in 1392 that reopened the trade. Still, what concerned the import of precious metals, it was decided to keep the business close to the Teutonic Order. So the forbidden land roads through Prussia, Courland and Sweden were reputedly being used for that. In fact, the order continued to export silver to Novgorod. Around 1400, its amount reached circa 200 kilos per year. We learn from these events that silver really was exported to Russia through Livonia and to some extent also through Prussia, Courland and probably Sweden, and the ban laid on its export could be a serious weapon in the trade war against Russia. Apart from silver ingots, coins were imported too. According to the fragmentary data, almost 3,000 Lübeck mark were bought to Riga, Tallin and Pärnu from Lübeck only in 1368 and 69. However, we may hardly presume that this cash was meant to be melted down and reminted in Livonia. Most probably it was needed in trade and everyday transaction here. It means in Livonia. The bracteates from the North German towns had to come to circulate in Livonia on a large scale since the local minting stopped in the early 1330s for 3 decades. They circulated largely, but because of the constant debasement, the bad bracteates were forbidden in 1370s in Livonia, and just in a very few cases they constitute a noteworthy part in Estonian halls after that. Well, now I have some data about, so this is ingots, about the silver price, but I will skip it because it's just numbers. But the main thing is that the silver became remarkably more expensive around the turn of the 14th, 15th century. No doubt the great European bullion famine that culminated circa 1395 till 1415 is to be blamed for the shrinking bullion supply and increasing silver prices in Livonia. However, minting in Tallinn and Tartu continued even these years. The rising silver price inevitably was met by a deliberate debasement. The minting standard of Tartu and Tallinn, which already had been worsened in 1390s, brought up more than 3 Riga mark of arctics from a weight mark of poor silver at least until 1406. And now it has to be abandoned, and very soon 5 mark arctics, that was a denomination, were coined from a weight mark of poor silver. But there was another denomination in Livonia too. It was called Lübische, after the small Lübisch pennies, which was worth 1/3 of an arctic, and that minor denomination was extensively minted in Tartu and later on also in Tallinn. Initially, its minting standard seems to have been 5 mark coins from a weight mark of silver, but very soon it worsened up to 8 mark. And in 1417, a certain person, allegedly an expert in minting issues, appeared as the master of the order and promised to manufacture even 20 mark coins from a weight mark of poor silver, to put the new money in circulation, to buy new silver for that, to mint it again, to pay for the silver obtained at first, and run the mint that way. There are some copper Lübisches now from Tallinn coated in lead and struck with ordinary dies, which indicates that these plans might have been realized to a certain degree. Apart from debasing coinage, the mints also operated as loan institutions, as there were no banks in medieval Livonia. In a word, they lent money to the citizens in coins and demanded it to be returned in silver. And that price of the silver they required back, that was it remained far below the ordinary market price of the time. For instance, the market price was 5 Riga mark for a weight mark of silver. We have to make difference between the money, the denomination of a mark, and a weight mark, which was a weight unit of approximately 200 grams. Well, the market price was around 5 mark, but the mints demanded, the mints bought silver with a price from 3 till 4 3/4 Riga mark, which was lower. So the loan policy of mints facilitated minting even in hard times. And an additional option was to use old coins, old arctics and Lübisches as raw material for new coins. There is no data about the origin of silver imported to Livonia at this time. All we know is that sometimes in contracts it was stipulated to repay the loan with the silver that should have come on the first or second ships, with an ersten anderen Schiffen, in Low German language. That is at the beginning or during the shipping season, which started normally in April or in May. Hence from abroad, most probably from Lübeck and other Hanseatic centers. Sometimes even the re-import of Novgorod grivnas is recorded, which as a rule were valued lower than other silver. The master of the order, who actively participated in delivering silver to the Tallinn mint, ordered it from the Grand Master in Prussia, but bought also from the merchants. The early 1420s faced an increase of the European silver supply, which made it possible to carry out a monetary reform in Livonia in 1422. Its goal was to improve the local currency that meanwhile has lost about 60% of its value, and thus restore the previous income of estate owners and landlords that had fallen respectively. As it would involve the corresponding increase of prices on domestic products, which would make their export impossible from Livonia. The reform encountered the resistance of leading Livonian towns and ended up in another inflation spiral. Nevertheless, the production of the mint in Tallinn was quite significant in the 1420s, 30s. But very soon, in approximately in 1440s, the next and more severe monetary depression followed in the West. Many mints were closed down because of absence of raw material. And once again, silver started to become more expensive in Livonia too. The mint in Tallinn started to operate the same way as it has done during the previous bullion famine, lending money that had to be returned in silver. Normally the interest gained by the mint was around 6%. That was quite usual in medieval Livonia. But sometimes it exceeded 11% and more. And in addition, Russian silver was re-imported again at a lower price than the Western purified silver and coined in Tallinn. In 1448, even the import of gold and silver from Holland to Prussia and Livonia was discussed and settled, but most probably it did not happen since non-minting took place in Holland during these decades, which strongly indicates that there were no silver resources available. In spite of that, the output of the mint in Tallinn and most probably in other Livonian centers dropped drastically. Well, you can see it on the graph. Making of major denomination shillings brought losses and was stopped by the mid-15th century. Since then, only the smaller coins, pfennigs, continued to be struck at a lower minting standard and in marginal quantities. That certainly was insufficient to meet the demands of the circulation. Coin halls that were very numerous in 1390s, 1420s now disappear almost totally, which is an indication that probably the people had nothing to hide. It was only in 1460s, 70s when Europe enjoyed a new increase in the silver supply. The mines in Schneeberg, Saxony, reached a peak of the production between 1476-85. Other discoveries in Saxony, Tyrol, Bohemia, etc. followed. The silver trade started again. The mints were reopened again all around Europe, and no wonder that the master of the order in Livonia also restarted the coinage around 1480. So did the Bishop of Tartu. Again, a lot of numbers that you don't need. Okay. And in addition, the growing Russian market seems to have consumed much more precious metals than before. Since the late 14th, early 15th century, a number of Russian centers had introduced their own coinage. However, it seemingly was only around the turn of the 15th to the 16th century when the Russians started to mint in substantial quantities. As reported by the town council of Tallinn to Lübeck in 1490, silver was being brought to Novgorod on a large scale and all of it was minted. The German merchants in Novgorod even had limited the quantity of silver that was allowed to deliver to the mint up to 30 weight mark. Although they complained about the bad quality of the imported silver, namely the Russian minting techniques requested as poor silver as possible. They made a silver wire that was cut in pieces and minted after that. So simple it was. You can see a sample. This, the endings of the wire, they are visible here, for instance. That made Russians to buy the highest quality metal with the purity of 15, 15.5, and even 15 3/4 of lot. The absolutely poor silver was that of the 16 lot. So that was a medieval scale of poorness of silver, which had to be hallmark and checked by chopping the ingots, possibly cutting off a piece of it. In German language, up den Hau, mach mal ein kleines Stücke, da Teken uppesteht, laten afhoven und an der Stadt stenden, da denen der Goldsmith vorstehen soll. That's medieval German. One must cut off a little piece with a hallmark on and send it to the town where the goldsmith works. So, the request was met with a full understanding by the Livonian merchants, for they also were highly motivated to keep good relations to their Russian partners. In order to avoid customs, in the main centers, the merchants transported silver to Narva, which was a frontier town with Russia, by unofficial land roads. Since it would contribute to the growing strength of the eastern enemy, the master of the order tried to prohibit the silver export from Livonia. On the Hanseatic Diet in Lübeck in 1507, the decision was made not to allow to carry silver to Russia through Poland and Livonia. And Henry, next year citizen of Tallin, who was sent abroad by the town council in order to acquire some silver, has been caught in Pomerania. Since he had not paid toll for his cargo, it was confiscated and never returned. Due to the high profit, Livonian merchants were highly interested in selling silver to Russians. Livonian mints, due to the imposed minting standard and high silver price, were not able to compete with the Russian market, and thus minting stopped again in Livonia around 1505. It was restored only in 1515 at a new and worsened minting standard. In order to guarantee the supply of raw material, it was suggested to compel the merchants to sell the silver exclusively to the mints. In a decree of the landlords from 1515, the percentage of the merchandise silver for the mints was set at 50% of the total, which is the compulsory price for a weight mark. That stipulation evoked the resistance of merchants, who again decreasing their duty to 1/3 of the total. And seemingly even that proportion was unrealistic and has never been followed. Now silver mainly came from Sweden, where the mines at Sala began to be exploited in 1509. Besides that, German silver continued to be brought in. Despite its origin, the silver import took place mainly via Lübeck. The Swedish silver was slightly cheaper than the German one. Perhaps slightly worse quality, the worst quality now. But by 1530s, the thalers, the coin thalers started to constitute the main bulk of the imported silver. Thus, these were the foreign importers who determined the price of thalers, that of the silver. From time to time again, it was tried to compel the silver traders to deliver a certain proportion of their precious metal to the mints, as well as fix the exchange rate of thalers on a certain level, but these goals were never achieved. As before, the merchants continued to trade silver to the east. Quoting the words of the Tallin mint master Urban Dene, no silver was too expensive for Russians. The need for silver in Russia became particularly acute after the monetary reform of 1535-37. The account book of Tallinn merchant Ulrich Ehlersen, for example, reveals that whereas in 1535 no silver was sold to Russians, it made up to 57% of his export in 1537. A big problem for Livonians now as before was the minting costs that consisted mainly of the staff salary, the upkeep of the mint, the schlagschatz, that was a rent paid to the municipal authorities, and the metal losses. That altogether constituted circa 7 or 8% of the coinage in Tallinn average. It caused a situation that persons delivering silver into the mints always received a smaller amount of it in coins in return. This made them to raise the silver price, that in turn caused periodical debasement. In between, old and foreign coins were melted down and reused. But in 1558, the Russian-Livonian War broke forth. The same year, Russians seized the two important Livonian centers, Narva and Tartu. The military forces of Livonia were far too weak for resistance, and the master of the order had to employ mercenaries. This measure, in turn, required a lot of money that he simply did not have. In addition, all kinds of speculations with coined money began that made silver much more expensive as before and caused the outflow of the small change. The regulations published by the landlords on monetary issues failed, as always. Thus, the master was forced to pawn certain positions, borrow money from abroad, and as a desperate measure, confiscate the silver belonging to the churches and guilds and coin it into emergency money. However, it did not help for long, and on 6 June 1561, Tallin surrendered to the Swedish king Erik XIV. Erik immediately sent a substantial aid, more than a metric ton of Swedish silver, to Tallin, 736 kilos of which were delivered to the mint. That amount lasted until January 1533. Further on, Tallin again faced difficulties in the silver supply, in particular because Russians had made Narva the competing center of the trade with Western Europe. As before, they were able to buy thalers at a higher price than Livonians. Also, the spread of Swedish low-quality coins struck for the military needs contributed to the expensiveness of silver. Tallin was forced to base its coins according to the rising silver price and finally stopped the minting in 1585. However, Sweden continued to issue bad money and the silver price correspondingly kept growing. The efforts of the Swedish authorities to impose compulsory and low exchange rates to the thaler totally failed. It was only in 1594 when King Sigismund III succeeded in stopping the inflation in Sweden, including Tallin, and restored good money, but for a while. By the 17th century, that was I told you. By the 17th century, Tallin lost its importance as a trade center at the Baltic. The coins were struck just occasionally, with long interruptions and usually in small quantities. Only rarely one can find data about how silver was obtained or was planned to purchase for minting. One of these rare cases belonged to the year 1625, when the Tallin mint was rented out to the town councillor Heinrich Lanting. In order to provide the mint with silver, Lanting took the mint master of Hamburg, Christoph Feustel, for his associate on the equal basis. Feustel committed to purchase silver of the very low quality in the Bank of Hamburg. It had to be paid either with thalers or with goods brought from Tallinn. But as appeared, Lanting did send neither money nor goods to Hamburg, spent the silver already received for his personal needs, and the whole plan failed. Besides that, Feustel provided the mint with thalers, Spanish reals, Russian kopecks, and so-called granalia, which was silver waste, as raw material. These were just the main silver sources in the early 17th century for the Tallinn mint. However, buying thalers for mints was complicated because copper money was introduced in Sweden in the 1620s. Copper coins soon began to lose their value and thus increased the exchange rate of thalers, which made silver too expensive. During the 17th century, copper money was periodically discounted. Finally, it cost just a third of its initial value, and correspondingly, the exchange rates of thalers raised, and the minting small change became unprofitable from time to time. Sometimes, for example, in 1671, using thalers as raw material was also forbidden in Sweden. That turned out to be fatal for the short-term minting activities in Narva that started in 1670. Very soon, in 2 years, the initiator of minting a town council, Levin Numens, was imprisoned and died. The coinage in Narva seized. Apart from the coin silver, the mine silver, the called Bergsilber, most probably from Germany, is mentioned in 1620s. At the end of the 17th century, the import of silver from England and Netherlands with an interest of 20% was discussed. Very obviously, as we know, there's no silver mines in England and Netherlands, so it had to be the silver from Mexico or from anyway from overseas countries. But by then the Swedish authorities already had stopped minting in Tallin. Since 1675, only very rare gold coins were produced in the Tallin mint. They were the very last of them probably in 1681. Conclusions. The absence of precious metals in Livonia was nothing catastrophic in normal times. The trade balance of Tallinn, as well as other Livonian centers, was as a rule in surplus with the West. Whilst their overseas trading partners compensated for this with silver. In hard times, however, when there was a shortage of silver in the West too, it was met by different means in Livonia. First of all, the increasing silver price was compensated by numerous debasements. Secondly, the mints operated like banks, lending money in coins that had to be returned in silver at a lower price. Thirdly, every kind of silver accessible, old coins, peasants' ornaments, silver wares, even silver plate and jewelry from the churches and guild houses was collected and coined. Despite the competing Russian market, Livonia seems to have done quite well until the outbreak of the Livonian War. During the most 17th century, indeed, the increase of the silver price caused by the Swedish copper money and, most of all, the disadvantageous economic situation are to be blamed of the downfall of minting in Tallinn. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
You know, at the time of the Livonian War, trade across Asia had really opened up because of the Mongols. Were there any sources of silver? I mean, my understanding is the first firearms or cannons were used in Europe in the Livonian War because of the introduction of gunpowder from Asia. Was there no trade in metals with
between Russia and
China?
And China, well, that's a good question, but for the Russian historians, I believe had to be a trade between them, but.
Because you have you talk about trade going east, but there might have been some trade going west under the Mongols.
On the Mongols? Yes, of course, but on the Mongols, you mean the time before the Livonian War, or what time do you mean?
Well, see, Mongols was what, 13th century?
Since 14th century, 13th, 14th, 15th century, the main Russian trade center was Novgorod, and yes, the trade between Novgorod and the Hanseatic League was very tight and very lively. Yes, of course, there was a Hanseatic counter for German merchants in Novgorod, and before that for the Gotlandic merchants also. So there were very tense relations between the merchants. Until the so-called counter was closed by the Tsar Ivan III in 1494, and then that trade was moved just into the Livonian cities in Tallinn, Tartu, and Riga. but it continued until 1557, and then even the terrible called their merchants back from Livonian center.
Well, have any Asian coins ever been found?
No, just one. Just one, very occasionally, and because that's a nice story, because we have a lot of holes from the Viking Age, and one of them was excavated. The find spot was excavated to find additional coins and so on, and so they found one coin which was very strange, and so later on I looked close at it, and it revealed to be a Tartarian coin from the 15th century. Very worn, and it's occasionally it was found on the field near the find spot. So no, we don't have them. They have been found, perhaps some of them in Lithuania, which had other contacts southward and so on, but not in Livonian territories.
I'd like to just make a follow-up on that. I mean, because in the literature it's frequently said that China was this endless final resting place of silver forever and so on, and it's not the case. In the period that you're talking about, silver was more valuable in the Mediterranean than it was in China, and there were very significant flows of silver to Europe.
Yeah.
From China.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
And so we have to be careful, we say, well, what period of time are we talking about? Because people say, well, just there's this mysterious, endless flow, from west to east in across Eurasia, which is incorrect. We're taking too small of a time frame.
Yes, that issue was discussed on that conference in Novgorod. So because I wondered, because there are some data about the monetary reforms in Russia that correspond timely with the silver crisis in the West, and so I just asked, where you get money from?
Right.
And so they cannot answer me, and so they propose that probably it was brought from the East, from China,
exactly.
for instance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other part too is that and I don't know because I'm not an expert about this, but I just read in the secondary literature, but the silver coming back from China during this Mongol period of time can be minted in Europe, and then some of it could end up in your region, but as European coins, but the silver is not from Europe, it was from China, and so you have to be careful, right? I mean,
but
did it come in the form of bullion? Did it come in the form of coins? And then when it comes in the form of coins, I'm not in any time period, it can be melted into bullion and reminted elsewhere, or it could come in bullion and be minted into coins. So just saying, well, the trade and therefore coins go in the opposite direction, say,
it's not so simple.
Don't say that. Don't say that. Don't think that.
It's not so simple at all. But as there is no written data about the trade between China and Russia from that period, so it's very difficult to find out whether it was true or. And then the metal analysis don't help very much, because it has been done a lot of them, but the metal is so mixed in the coins that it's very rare cases it's possible to establish the origin of the metal.
Right.